And we are live. Welcome everyone to another live broadcast. I am Farhan Qureshi, and I'm here with Brother Amir Mourad. Namaskar, and welcome, Brother Amir.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Okay, I'm getting an echo.
Yes, I can hear an echo.
Yeah. I just got rid of it. I had a separate screen open, so I just got rid of it. So, I have been in absolute reverence in terms of your knowledge, in terms of your sadhana. You are a true inspiration to me. I subscribed to you about 2 years ago when I was first looking into Hinduism and Buddhism, and you were definitely one of the initial inspirations that I had in terms of continuing my progress on this journey of meditation and yoga and dharma and so on and so forth. And so I thank you so much for the work that you do and for being an inspiration.
Namaskar. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we'll go ahead and get into some of the questions that I had, and then we'll field questions from the audience afterwards. And so the first question that I had for you, Brother Amir, was what would you say to the person who has had an interest in meditation, yoga, dharma, self-realization, or even renunciation, which is, a far deeper, more profound path that one might take. But then they come from a background, a religion, a tradition, or a family that might not understand why my son or my daughter or my brother or my sister is taking upon this path. What advice would you have for someone like that?
Well, first, I wouldn't necessarily consider renunciation a more profound path to tread upon. I am reminded of a statement of one Zen master whose name was Hakuin. I don't know if maybe you may have heard of him. He said that meditation in silence, in activity, is far superior to meditation in stillness. And that always struck, when I heard this, it was extremely insightful to me because that is profoundly truthful. When you're living in isolated atmospheres where all distractions have been minimized to your convenience, it can be quite easy for you to fall into an illusion of silence or an illusion. Whereas when you're in the midst of the chaos of the world, this offers far greater chances for you to test the stability of your silence. So I wouldn't necessarily consider it a more profound path. It certainly does come with some challenges. Some people have certain romanticized ideas about what it means to live as a renunciate in the world. But here's a society when you can just cross the street and go to the supermarket and everything is pretty much accessible to your convenience. Just have a little bit of money in your pocket. Not everybody would be comfortable, let's say, living in a climate where you're at the mercy of nature. And you have to be dependent upon nature in so many different ways. You have to get your survival skills up to speed, so to speak. So yeah, it certainly does come with certain challenges, but so does learning a way of being where you can be meditation in the world. That also comes with certain challenges. So neither path I consider to be better or worse than the other. They're just simply different paths. And the path of the renunciate, I have to say, it is by nature only compatible with a very small minority of people. So what about the majority of people who don't have that luxury of time and space to be able to live in such a way? So I feel that learning how to be more integrated in the midst of the society is a path which is much more accessible to, much more relevant to the average person. As far as the spiritual process itself, truth is the greatest value of human life. In my understanding, there's nothing higher than truth. And as you're entering into the spiritual process, you may have to make many sacrifices. I really think it's more of a question of, are you willing, not so much of a question of, are you going to be judged by your family and friends and acquaintances, but more of a question of, are you willing to sacrifice certain things in the process? Because if you have been living a life where the mind has been clouded with egotism and attachment, you don't just have one attachment, you have a million attachments. So the question is, how much are you willing to sacrifice to enter deeper into this kind of process? But part of what a spiritual process means is that you're rising in your independence, intelligence, and awareness beyond the influences that might exist in the society. And if that requires you sacrificing a certain amount of relationship, then I think it is a worthy sacrifice. Because ultimately, I mean, if you consider the psychology of most parents, they're far more interested. Yes, they're concerned with a certain aspect of your well-being, probably, and with all the good intentions, but whether they're concerned with your ultimate well-being, that is questionable. Because when you're talking about ultimate well-being, you're thinking of what is it which is going to bring me enduring freedom and happiness in this life. And this was a question which was extremely significant for my own process, because I started looking just at the basic facts of my life and seeing that not only am I myself not peaceful and contented, but do I even know a single human being who I can say is truly peaceful, silent, and contented? And I could not say yes to that question. So if the people who I'm surrounded by, particularly my loved ones, if they themselves do not know what is enduring peace in this life, then in what position are they to teach me about what it means to live a peaceful life? So I think that these are worthy sacrifices, and it shouldn't be out of a kind of spiteful rebellion, because that is its own prison. I can understand that the parents, they want to give you a certain foundation for your well-being, but oftentimes that foundation is loaded with expectations, and that is a prison of its own. So, if you're setting your priorities clear in mind, then you're now starting to become more sensitive to what is essential to human well-being and disregarding giving too much importance to that which is non-essential.
I love how you say that, fulfilling the expectations of the world can be imprisonment in of itself, and I also appreciate how you say that this path is supposed to be a path of liberation. It's supposed to be a path of contentment and things of that nature. Usually the story that I have in mind is the story of Shankara, who pleaded with his mother to become a sannyas, and she didn't want him to, and then there was the story of how the crocodile had bit his foot and was yanking him towards the water, and when his mother screamed out to him, said, let me be a sannyas, and the crocodile will let go, and the crocodile let him go, and he ended up in there's that scene of the child or the adolescent or the young adult who decides crying and stuff like that, and it's like, wow, that's kind of where my initial thoughts of intensity come from. But like you said, those are some of the challenges that come with it, and the idea is ultimately impermanence, right?
Coming to terms with the impermanence of things, certainly. And speaking of that subject, it does remind me of the story of Gautama Buddha, which you probably know very well, that he lived the luxurious life of a prince, and as it was the custom in the Indian society, when a child would be newly born, they would collect the astrologers and they would erect the horoscopes as to what would be the destiny or the fate of the child. So they did that, and they found that they basically told the father of Gautama that this child has basically only two paths accessible to him. Either he's going to become a great spiritual leader, or he's going to become the ruler of the kingdom. So the father who transfer the lineage to his children, of course, he wanted to Gautama to rise to the throne. So he made elaborate care to make certain that Gautama Buddha would be sheltered from everything that could be unpleasant or disturbing influence, or which would lead to greater questions as to the significance or the meaning of life. So eventually Gautama was surrounded by this tremendous luxury, and seeing that in spite of this luxury, nevertheless, still he found there was a certain vacuum, a certain hollowness that still remained unfulfilled. So he started questioning one day, okay, what just exists outside of the boundaries of the palace? So he went out with his servant, and they were just treading along the path, scenes which he had never before experienced. He sees a man who looks a very strange appearance. So he asks his servant, what's wrong with this man? And he said, oh my lord, this man is ill. Gautama Buddha said, ill? Again, we don't know if this is historically factual story, but nevertheless, it's what does it represent, which is much more significant. So he said, oh, ill? What does that mean? Oh my lord, one day for everybody, the ways of the body are going to fail. Oh, does this mean that everybody will meet the same fate? The servant said, yes, my lord, I'm sorry, it's so. So they continued walking down the path. He notices another man with a very strange appearance. He said, what's wrong with this man? The servant replied, oh my lord, this man is growing old. Gautama said, old? What does that mean? Oh my lord, one day, not only is it going to fall ill, but it's going to be unsuitable for life. Atman said, oh, does this mean that everybody is going to... Yes, my lord, I'm sorry to continue walking down the path. Finally, they see a corpse filled with worms and maggots, surrounded by flies. And he asks him, oh, what's wrong with this man? The servant said, oh, this is no longer a man, this is just a dead body. That man has been dead for several weeks. Then he said, oh, does mean that every single body will wither away in the earth? I'm sorry. Finally,
Brother Mir, I think your voice is cutting off a little bit. I'm not sure if it is.
Oh, can you? How's the sound now?
That's good. That's good.
It's better. Okay. So ultimately, he found, okay, having his illusions shattered, he went into isolation and thought to himself, okay, I have to find a much greater significance as to the problem of well-being. How is it possible to live in this world being truly peaceful, silent, and contented, and knowing my life being surrounded by such luxury, it has not managed to provide me with that. So without a single word's notice, he simply got up in the middle of the night and left the palace, the kingdom, to live the life of a renunciant. And that was a tremendous sacrifice, because keep in mind, at that time he had a wife, he had children. Nevertheless, in his mind, there was a much greater priority. That's really the quality of a spirit, the spirit of a seeker of truth. It's really a certain kind of burning curiosity that occupies the mind. It's almost sort of like a haunting effect on your consciousness. Because ultimately you want to urgency of the matter that the time available to discover what is true enduring well-being in this life is very short. So certainly what you have said earlier regarding seeing the basic fact of impermanence, certain urgency to be intensely involved into this kind of inquiry.
Brother Amir, with regards to the narrative of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, when he saw illness and old age and death, would you say that there is a non-duality, a oneness, or an equivalence to the experience of general human beings who, after the reality of illness, old age, and death hits them, that they go through that similar spiritual process?
Actually, most people are not. It's really a myth, the fear of death, which most people are occupied by. What it is, which is the true fear, is the fear of the loss of the illusion of self.
Brother Min, could you repeat yourself? You cut off there.
Yes, I was saying that it's actually not the fear of death, which is an occupying force for a lot of human life. It is actually, in reality, the fear of losing the illusion of self. And it is that which creates all of the psychological turmoil that a lot of people pass through in the process of dying. This is why in Zen, they don't just refer to this as an ordinary kind of death. They refer to this as the great death. And it's not just a matter of losing the illusion of self, because in a certain way, you've created a dream. If your mind has been living covered with egotism, ignorance of oneself, and delusion, it's almost as though you've created a dream universe within your mind. It's not just a matter of what is yourself, but what is the relationship of that self to the larger cosmos? What is the role that you are playing in the scheme of things? So all of that is brought into question.
For sure, for sure. The self-realization, everything seems to just point back to the self. And then what is the self? The sort of deconstruction from there would lead to consciousness, would you say? Or what would you say in terms of where does the deconstruction process lead to?
Now, this is where my understanding is might differ from traditional or more conventional understanding. I know that there are some traditions like Advaita Vedanta, which make the statement that your true nature is pure consciousness, or not just pure consciousness, that this consciousness is all-pervading and eternal. And I have my own criticisms about that.
Yeah, I saw your latest video, and I do subscribe to the Advaita Vedanta school of thought. I'm going to let you get into it in just a moment. I would say that, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I value the differences of opinion. You know, I'm the type of person, even in the Hindu tradition, if somebody says Vishnu is supreme, and myself being a Shaivite, I think that that's adorable. I think that that's awesome for someone to, particularly if they take it on an experiential level or a philosophical level. I think that that's great. And so same thing when it comes to some of these other dharmic traditions, whether, you know, in terms of the Atman, Anatman debate, I don't mind it. I think it's awesome. And, you know, it's not an issue of trying to convert anybody. It's all about what you experience it as, for me. But please do get into it.
Because of that sort of psychology, because in the East, it was a very unusual way of thinking that there must be only one absolute path or one absolute approach, unlike the Abrahamic traditions, which have become part so intrinsic to the Western culture. Rather, this is the reason why mystics and yogis and sages flourished in the East, because of this general psychology that it was a very unusual way of thinking to believe that there must be only one specific medicine for one kind of person. Rather, the understanding was there's simply different types of medicine suitable for different kinds of individuals, and that's logical. The diversity that exists in humanity is just simply part of the diversity of nature. So it's simply unrealistic to believe that you're going to expect the whole humanity to fit into a cage of one single philosophy or one particular religion. So culture was very common, at least at a certain time in India. And that's precisely the reason why these sort of debates flourished. And never was there the threat that, oh, somebody's going to be killed because of the beliefs that he holds.
Beautiful. Absolutely. And so, yeah, and you know, that differences of opinion is what, you know, what definitely guided me towards the dharmic traditions as well, is that if you have the wrong aqidah, if I can use an Arabic word in here just for a moment, or, you know, if your interpretation of certain things is off, then there is, you're going to go to hell, right? Your aqidah is wrong. You have heretical beliefs and so on and so forth. And with the dharmic traditions, it's more about the science that ultimately, and it's not about the science itself. It's what happens as a result of the science. And this is something that I've gotten from your videos as well.
And if you ask me, it's not really so much even a matter of the truth, because what is far more important is what is useful for your spiritual growth. And if really the question is, what are the consequences that certain ideas create within your mind and body? What is the attitude and inner atmosphere that certain ideas create within the mind? That is what is much more significant than whether something is true or untrue. So, if you need a certain useful placebo to help you enter deeper into this process, then so be it.
Awesome. All right, so let's get in to some of these other questions, Brother Amir. All right, so when it comes to conflicts in the world, you have all sorts of right now. The North Korea stuff is going on. You have various situations all across the world, without getting into any specifics. But also, there's range of suffering in the world as well: multiple sclerosis, cancer, mental health issues, depression, and then there's things at the level of religious extremism and terrorism and that kind of stuff. And then there's racism and tribalism. So, I mean, we could, continue on and on about all of the challenges humanity faces. But from the perspective of a yogi, who comes from that upeksha, that non-judgment, that equanimous mind, how does the world look from that angle or from that lens?
There are certain misunderstandings about what has been called equanimity. Some people think that it means you are certain detached or aloof from the conditions of life. Really what it means is that there just has come a small gap of distance in your experience between the witnessing intelligence within you and the contents of the mind. And especially if there are certain conflicts that exist in the world, that is what demands even greater sense of balance, silence, and equanimity. There is, you don't want to drift to extremes either. So I always like to, this is the way that I like to describe it, as if you're living in two worlds simultaneously. On one side of the coin, you're living in the silent world, and that becomes the foundation of your equanimity. On the other hand, you're addressing exactly what is needed when it comes to the practical realities of life. So on one hand, you can perceive ultimately, if you're looking from the perspective of ultimate reality, all of those problems you mentioned will be seen to be made of the same stuff as dreams. But looking at the other side of the coin, even a dream creates very real and definite effects on your mind and body. It's a bit like, suppose you enter in a dream and you think that you're being chased by a lion. Even though there's no lion that's in your room, nevertheless, your mind and body produces all the responses as if you were being chased by the lion. So in terms of human suffering, certainly all of those things have very real and definite effects. So it does require that delicate balance where on one hand, you do see that ultimately all of this is illusory, but on the other hand, you have the sensitivity that's required to respond to what is the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to ask you a question, because with my Dharmic brethren, I had this question about the role of karma and samsara and things of that nature, and there's sometimes differences of opinion when it comes to whether life is meaningful or whether these are simply forces that are indifferent, right? Do you think that these are forces that are indifferent, or do you think that there are aspects of reality that are emotional, if you will? If not emotional, that they care about the well-being of human beings, of sentient beings,
Could you specify what you mean by when you say that there are aspects of reality which are emotional?
So I guess what I'm saying, because in the Abrahamic traditions, you get this idea that God cares about you, and maybe even in some of the Hindu traditions, where God is a personal God, there's a relationship with the divine in that sense. So, but and I've heard the differences of opinion from Buddhists and Hindus that say that karma and samsara is indifferent, that basically you are in a process of karma and samsara, and whatever you choose throughout the process is what you get in return. Whereas there's other interpretations that says that everything happens for a reason, that these things are meant to happen, that there's lessons to be learned, and things of that nature. What is your take on that perspective?
My own understanding is that whenever you're looking at any situation, you're always perceiving it from a certain one-sided angle and perspective. And to cling to one-sided angles and perspective can disturb your clarity into seeing the context of the situation. So certainly certain karmas you initiate, I wouldn't call them effects or...
I'm sorry, say that again. You said you wouldn't call it what?
I wouldn't say that the karmas that you generate in this life, that the universe is indifferent to that, because, you know, every single act creates a chain reaction of consequences. And the question is, how much of that chain reaction are you truly in control of? We don't really consider that how many factors are beyond our control. We were not in control of what time we were born in, what society, what parents, conditions of the economy, what are the conditions of the politics that surround us. And besides that, we were also definitely not in control of this inheritance of karma. Because when we say karma, if I'm going to justify it and make it practical and down to earth, it to be synonymous with memory. Basically, memory of the past recycled in the present.
Absolutely, I agree.
We have collected in this life, but beyond that, you know, how is it possible that a newborn child, a word of instruction without giving him any sort of training, he knows exactly where to go to the mother's breast for nourishment? Now you can call that instinct, but what is instinct if it doesn't have its origins in past experience? Yeah. So it's a bit like learning how to hit the keys of playing the musical tune on a piano. Maybe in the beginning you need a little bit of extra effort to hit the right notes, strengthened and reinforced. Now it just becomes automatic. And
so do you see like an evolution that's happening biologically, chemically, and spiritually, metaphysically?
Certainly. So yes, we've inherited this bundle of karma as a side effect of thousands and thousands of years of evolution, where there's been multiple human lives that have influenced these tendencies that we have collected in the process. Now the question is, your so-called past lives or the past lives of other human beings, that's an entirely different subject. So you are not in control of that either. But certainly what is within your hands is in this present moment, you can always rise in awareness beyond whatever compulsive influences that are functioning in your life. Lived as an Adolf Hitler. Nevertheless, do the necessary amount of work that's necessary. If your inquiry is pointed in the right direction, it should prevent you from coming to that deeper understanding.
So it's
however, I have to be delicate with that. There are, of course, some exceptions, because there's a rare category of suffering where I would say that that suffering has physical origins. You know, sometimes you may have, you know, permanent physiological damage in the nervous system or in the human brain. And of course, that permanent damage can determine basically how are you going to function in this life. You know, imagine like we just open up somebody's brain and we just cut out a chunk of his brain. You know, he's going to be forced to function in a particular way. Some sufferings, I would say, have their physical origins, but for the majority of suffering, certainly it's all self-created.
That's all.
And it's a wonderful, it's really a great luxury that it is self-created. People underestimate this fact, because if you can create it, if it is self-made, then you can unmake it as well. So if your state of well-being was determined by some god sitting in the sky, then it's sort of frozen, it's stamped upon your being. There's pretty much nothing that you can do. But if this is your own creation, if you manufactured your suffering exactly the same way, you can uncreate it.
And I found that meditation I've always found that meditation is, you know, the framework through which one can kind of resolve and undo and manufacture and remanufacture one's own cognitions, one's own perceptions, emotions, at the level of the mind and the body, for sure. And becoming acquainted with consciousness, the silent witness, the observer, and from that angle, being able to observe what's there and not react to it, and creating new neural pathways. I mean, neuroscience in of itself has confirmed the meditative path through so many researched and peer-reviewed articles. It's absolutely amazing. And you know, one thing that I hope that we get out of this is, because you know there have been a lot of people who have contacted me who have been through organized religions, say Christianity and Islam, and they're looking for an alternative path to confront their suffering. They're looking for a path for self-realization. And so, particularly, you know, people in the Middle East, تكلم عربي. نعم. تكلم عربي. نعم.
Right.
Do you speak Arabic? If there's any Arabic speakers who would you know, like to understand this tradition more, Brother Amir definitely speaks Arabic, and can explain it to you in Arabic as well. And it would be awesome if one day you would create a video on your channel in Arabic.
Actually, I really don't think my Arabic is proficient enough. My English is far more better than my Arabic.
Okay, sure. And same is the case with English is my first language as well. Yeah, I speak Hindi, Urdu fluently enough to have conversations, so and that kind of thing. But in terms of sophistication, the way that the poets can get, the poets of the language can get to, I can't get to that level either. But there's always room to improve. All right, Brother Amir, if we can get into another question, can you, being a Shaivite, can you tell us what Bhagwan Shiv means to you?
Well, I consider not just Shiva, but all the various different deities that exist in the East. My own approach to it is that these are metaphors for circles or different aspects of your own consciousness. Now, whether these principles have an objective intelligence of their own, that's really something I'm quite agnostic about. I don't say yes, I don't say no. The fact is that if you do experience something that could be the feeling of a tremendous intelligence or a presence, you have really no way to truly verify whether this is your own mental projection or whether this is something that has an objective existence of its own. So on that matter, I'm quite agnostic. I don't say no because I don't deny the possibility that perhaps such a thing is possible. Yet I don't say yes because we don't have solid evidence to support such a concept. So my own approach to this, again, coming back to what I was saying earlier, what's more relevant is whether certain methods are useful or not useful. Definitely, images like Shiva and many of the other deities, if you use them as part of a method for inner transformation, they can have profound effects for restructuring the nature of your unconscious and the conditioning of your unconscious. So Shiva, I just simply consider him as a metaphor for the destroyer of delusion. That type of quality of your consciousness, which is determined to overcome obstacles.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And
yeah, I've got in the diversity of which I've spoken, that is a common interpretation, and I think it's an interpretation that resonates with the rationalists of the world, with those who are trying to, you know, kind of put their foot into mysticism. That understanding is an understanding that can resonate and make sense to a lot of people. I think that there's others who might experience, you know, certain mystical realms on a more profound level. I think even the Buddhist and the Tantric scriptures and the Vajrayana scriptures, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and so on and so forth, speak of the spirit world, in which you know, there's this kind of interaction with other intelligences. So there's always, you know, there's always that possibility. I definitely lean in that possibility, and I think that that's the only way to know the spirit world to that degree, is to experience it yourself, and even then your perceptions of it are limited. But I agree with you. I think that there are things, most of these things empirically and rationally we are agnostic about. I would also use that term.
If they do exist, here's the thing, that if these realities do exist, my own feeling is that they would definitely exist in a way that's well beyond the cultural context of the way we imagine them to be. Because it's not a coincidence that if you look at the Chinese culture, the deities that they've created have Chinese faces, they like Chinese culture, they have Chinese likes and dislikes. Similarly, in India, it's going to be very much under the influence of what particular culture that you're living in. So all of these deities, I think we have enough evidence to show us that largely human projection. However, whether there are other intelligence that exist beyond the way that we imagine, or like I said earlier, I'm quite agnostic about that.
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with Carl Jung, the psychologist, and his concepts of archetypes?
Certainly, and that's why I say what's far more important is what do these images represent to your consciousness?
Absolutely. I think that we get caught up in symbology and the exoticness. Sorry.
Yes. Continue, I'm listening.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, brother. I think that we get caught up in the symbols and the external, the outer appearances of things, and the external and exoteric representations and rituals, rather than paying attention to the heart of the matter, the spirit of the matter. And I think that is a common misnomer, misunderstanding of the population in general. And I appreciate you pointing that out. But was there something that you wanted to add, brother?
And not just with our attitude towards these various deities, but even certain people who we might consider to be historical or not historical, like Jesus Christ, for example. What's far more important is not whether he had any true or not, but what does Jesus Christ represent to your mind? What is the significance of a Gautama Buddha? Really, the question, looking at them in terms of personalities, is really a very superficial understanding. Because in the first place, especially when it comes to spiritual process, we've always been, ultimate realization is that the sense of ego or the self is an illusion. So what's far more significant is certain aspects of your own consciousness and human nature. So create a quality of Buddha, or a quality of Jesus, or a quality of a Bodhidharma, much more significant. So to look at these things from perhaps a more impersonal point of view, I think is a much more sensible attitude.
No, I love it. I agree. I mean, I'm very much into science and philosophy, and that's the type of interpretation that usually resonates. I don't close myself out to other interpretations. I use similar words like agnostic, and given that that's where we're ending on this particular question, why don't we get into the future of the yogic traditions? What do you see is the future of the yogic traditions of Dharma in the world? We have the millennial generation that's taking over. The baby boomers, which were largely traditionalists, they have about, say, 20 years left on average. And when the millennials do take over, which is inevitable, there's a whole new generation that's taking over, and a whole new generation that is raising the next generations to come. And so in terms of the world, in terms of dogmatism in the form of the Abrahamic religions, in terms of materialism with regards to atheism, and in terms of spirituality and the Dharmic traditions, what do you see is the future?
It has much potential for the future, assuming you approach this thing that's being called yoga as now. If you look in the East, there's a very good reason why yoga. Hindus have practiced yoga. Jains have practiced yoga. Atheists have practiced yoga. In spite of all of these various differences of beliefs, interpretations, and philosophies, nevertheless, all have made use of because this is the nature of what you call technology. I don't know how you would define technology, but my is very simple. You're simply using the laws of nature to influence nature to a specific end result. So we normally think of technology in terms of external machines or computers or things we have invented of that kind, but it's not very common to think of of technology in an inner sense, that there can be an inner technology for human perception. So in the same sense, if we can integrate yoga as a technology, I think it has tremendous potential. I mean, look at our modern technology, whether it's in China, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in India, whether it's in the United States. Once again, in spite of these various differences of culture and belief, for modern technology. So that's the beauty of technology, something that's very practical and down to earth. It's not in the least concerned with whatever mental projections or philosophies may have manufactured in the mind. Its primary concern is simply certain causes create certain effects. And whatever you interpret from that experience, that's your own business. Causes effects.
100%. 100%.
Something which was kind of approach to the yogic sciences was something that I found to be extremely inspiring when I was entering deeper into this process. Because in the beginning, I too, like yourself probably, I was very much interested in philosophy, particularly in my earlier years. I was quite different from what you see now. I was suffering from depression, combined with hyperactivity, combined with overwhelming fear of death. So all of those things combined together, my mind was in a mess. So I just started questioning and inquiring into. So I started researching Socrates, Plato, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, these type of people. And I found a very interesting situation that in a book, a certain line of reasoning, which would appear to be absolutely convincing. Yes, this guy knows what he's talking about. He knows the truth. Sometime later, I'll be reading another book, again, very convincing line of reasoning, and yet conclusions will be the opposite. So how do I know if I'm going to be dependent on these philosophies? How do I know whether what I'm saying is true or not? Well, the more knowledge that I acquired was just simply the more and more confused I have become. So I'm satisfied with it. That's why I abandoned that. And I went philosophy. And once again, I found a similar situation. Multiple different interpretations, multiple different theories. However, here was the key. They weren't just simply talking about beliefs or philosophy, or method, or transformation. As if they were saying, okay, here's a hypothesis, but you need not accept the hypothesis. Now, here are the methods of investigation to verify through your own intelligence whether such things exist or not. A quality which really struck me, approach to inquiry. And for the day, what value is the truth? It does not lead to inner transformation. Because, you know, ultimately, we're not even interested in truth. We think that truth is going to be the source of our freedom and well-being. So the person who is interested in entering into a paradise with God, interested in paradise. He's not interested in God. What he's much more interested in, he thinks paradise or God is going to be the source of his human well-being. So ultimately, at the very end, what's the real driving force of human behavior? We are seeking an enhanced sense of freedom and well-being.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, Brother Amir. Everything from the limitations of philosophy to applying the methodology, the technology, and benefiting from the results. And as you said, however you interpret the results, however you interpret your experience is up to you. But what the technology will do is that it will bring about some level of inner transformation that's going to make it self-apparent to you. And I mean, that's exactly how. Yep, go ahead, brother.
I have to emphasize something, that it's not only a matter of employing the technology. I mean, it's good to have the practical technology, but it's also not even a question of discipline. Practicing something for 10, 20, 30 years and still be repeating the same vicious cycles that you've been repeating for ages. The question is, what is what we call right discipline? or right effort. And I think that's a very important distinction to make in the mind. If you're practicing certain methods in a way which is only strengthening the illusion of self, you're going deeper into yoga is only going to contribute to your ignorance. So I really consider that to be extremely important as well, not just employing the technology, but with what spirit, with what attitude, kind of discipline.
For sure. For sure. Absolutely. All right, brother, we're going to get on to two more. I have two more questions, and we're going to get into the audience. The next question that we have is, how can we honor the past? For example, it took generations upon generations to develop this technology, to develop this knowledge and this perspective. It's been threatened by various invasions and stuff like that. And yet, the cultures that inherit these traditions aren't always grateful for the knowledge that they have either. So how can the future continue to honor the past, revere the past, and yet how can we also transcend labels that limit us?
Well, it is important to honor the past because, I mean, how much can you truly achieve on your own? Just imagine if you were born completely, all the knowledge that you would need to discover in a single lifetime, you would have to discover it from scratch. Maybe one lifetime will not be enough. You know, it's a bit similar to think in terms of modern science. Imagine if from absolute nothing, thousands and thousands of what has been taken painstaking effort to discover. One lifetime will not be enough, but today you can just enter into a classroom and in one afternoon, in just maybe a half an hour, you can accelerate and learn all of that. It's very important to honor the past because really when you look into it, how much can you truly achieve on your own? But at the same time, we have to be sensitive to the fact that demonstrates how the mind can be so vulnerable to illusion. Field of human knowledge, whether it's philosophy, whether it's religion, whether it's politics, the process is no exception. This is why, I mean, when you look at the ocean of inner exploration that has happened in the, you'll see a very wide spectrum. Is you will find people who've been considered sages who are more mixture.
By the way, you're cutting off.
Okay, now sound is fine?
Now it's good, brother. Thank you.
Among the stages of these, we see a whole spectrum. We see certain people who, you know, they're leaning more towards superstitious thinking. Some have been a combination where some genuine insight into reality, and certain sages which I would consider to be largely rooted in genuine discoveries. And seeing this tremendous diversity, I mean, it's very important that you're inquiring into things out of your own intelligence. This is why there's something which I call dogmatic mysticism. Why a Sufi inner certain inner process, and he might experience profound inner transformation. Reason why he will interpret that experience according to the framework of his theology. He will not be thinking along, say, lines of Buddhist thinking. Similarly, for the Christian, he might enter into inner process, and he will interpret all of those experiences according to the context of his theology. So it reminds me of Ramakrishna. Of course, you probably know Ramakrishna.
Mm-hmm.
And Ramakrishna, as you know, he was a tremendous devotee of the goddess Kali. To such an extent that just hearing the name Kali, he was all unconscious into wild ecstasy.
Mm-hmm.
However, was that his love for Kali was so tremendous that when he would enter deep into his meditation, he could never manage to bypass the image of Kali. Every time he would see Kali, he would just thrown once again into a wild ecstasy and lose all awareness. So he went to see one of his masters. His name was Totapuri, And he explained to him what's the situation. So Totapuri told him, all right, here's what you should do. Next time you enter into meditation, do something very simple. Just erect a sword and drive it through her chest. Ramakrishna said, oh, that sounds like it's going to be unpleasant. I have such love for my goddess. And anyway, where am I going to get a sword from? From exactly the same place where you got Kali. Just as you have fabricated Kali in your mind, in exactly the same way, drive it through her chest. He thought, okay, I'll give it a try. So he went off in isolation, went deep into the meditation, once again saw the image of Kali, lost all awareness, and fell again into wild ecstasy. He returned back to Totapuri and he told him, okay, I've tried applying your advice and I found it was not successful. Totapuri told him, okay, this seems to be a really serious situation. Just sit now here in front of me, enter deep into the meditation, and once you see the image of Kali, just give me the signal. I will do the rest. So he did as he was instructed. He went deep into the meditation, saw the image of Kali, gave the signal. Immediately the master was sitting with a piece of glass in his hands. He gave him a sharp cut on the forehead where the third eye is. And just from that physical shock, his mind managed to bypass the image. Finally, he realized what is his true nature. This is something which we have to be very sensitive to. The tendency of the mind to create things in its own image, according to its own identifications.
Of course.
The situation of such a mind is very important to cultivate viveka, discrimination between the real and the unreal. And that is really like a muscle. When you build a physical muscle, this is like a muscle. Through constant training and reinforcement, it's not something that you're born with. It's something that you cultivate in time.
Absolutely.
So that's very important.
I mean, the importance of viveka in the ability of the mind to discriminate truth from falsehood is one of the most important tools that we have. It's literally the difference between delusion / illusion and seeing reality as it is. And Siddhartha Gautama Buddha and so many other great teachers have constantly to try to take us back to that discrimination. So that being said, Brother Amir, let's get into my final question before we get into the audience. What do you have to say about the exclusivity doctrines within Christianity and Islam that say you're going to go to hell unless you subscribe to... Hello, can I be heard?
Hi, Farhan. Please repeat that because
sorry about that.
Yes, the signal was breaking.
Okay. Yeah, I'll repeat the last question, Brother Amir. The last question was, what do you have to say about the exclusivity doctrines within Christianity and Islam that say that unless you have this aqidah, that unless you have this theology, that you will, that your destiny is hellfire, eternal hellfire? And also, since I'm asking this question, would you briefly mind touching, if you mind, if you don't mind, it's up to you. What is your background when it comes to Islam? Because we know that you you're Egyptian, Canadian. If you don't mind sharing that, that's the question.
I was born to Christian parents, but we did a lot. From Egypt, we went to Kuwait, lived for a very short time in Kuwait. There was a war that was happening there. From there, I moved to Saudi Arabia, lived for maybe a good 2-3 years there, and then finally I moved to Dubai. And I grew up there for maybe a good 12 to 15 years before coming. No stranger to that sort of cultural influence. I even remember building friendships and where there would be a lot of peer pressure for me to look into their religion. There was a brief time where I was curious, and I did start looking into multiple different religions, Islam being one of them. But again, the idea that you must, on the basis of blind faith, was never something that made logical sense to me. And especially because of knowledge, coming back to what I was talking about earlier, I had researched not just into different religions, but into multiple different philosophies. I saw this basic situation that deceiving themselves. In spite of the tremendous spectrum of opinions and interpretations, they can't all be correct. So that led me to really put emphasis on what sort of standards have you created for truth? Is it enough to simply believe? In terms of belief, you could believe in anything. Anything with enough strong emotional attachment can masquerade itself as the truth.
So in terms of religions claiming that you're going to go to hell if you don't believe, how do you, what perceptions do you have when you hear like Christians saying that you're a heathen, or a Muslim saying that I am a kuffar, or somebody who on this path is?
You know, this type of psychology, which has been glorified, I don't see it as far too removed from a type of fascism.
Absolutely.
It is even worse than fascism. At least Adolf Hitler will leave you alone. If, you know, you might go through a lot of torture and then eventually die, a dictator won't even leave you alone after you've dropped the body. Mm. And what kind of logical sense is it that you should suffer for eternal suffering for actions which are fundamentally impermanent and finite? Mm. This is the behavior of a childish lunatic.
I agree.
So
I completely agree. That's the conclusion I came to. You know, I mean, I don't understand how anybody sees it any other way. You know, obviously, my background being in psychology, I argue relative perception. I understand that everybody has a unique perception of reality, that there's elements of indoctrination that's there. But for the best of me, I don't understand how anybody can believe in an exclusivity doctrine of this sort. And so that's why I have somebody on, I get their insight. Am I the only one? So I appreciate that, Brother Amir. All right, so let's go ahead and turn to the audience. Go ahead, brother. Go ahead.
I can understand why some people fall into kind of thinking. I can definitely understand it. You know, it's very difficult to live in this world without attachment to knowledge of some kind. You know, it's not necessarily about being attached to a certain doctrine or religion. Just to be attached to your own way of thinking, that is still, according to me, that is still dogmatic. Any type of attachment to a fixed way of looking at the universe, in my understanding, that is itself falling into dogmatism. So you might be an atheist and still be as passionately dogmatic as a theist, just in terms of your inner quality. You know, to live in this world without feeling the desire for psychological security requires a tremendous amount of awareness. The feeling that you're living in the universe in which all of your actions are being overlooked by the Supreme Being, that gives you a certain sense of comfort, it gives you a certain sense of security, because the alternative is that you're living in a vast universe which is indifferent to the desires of man. For that, just to escape this unpleasant fact, we've created so many methods of self-deception. It's not just something limited to organized religion.
I agree. I completely agree. I think that there's a lot of socio-culture, socio-political scenarios that really can bring about bondage for human beings, and it's an issue of expanding awareness. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and get into some questions from the audience. And the first question that I have is from Brother Nassim: is being selfish good sometimes?
Selfish?
I'm sorry about that, Amir. Did you catch that question?
Yes, I did. I said, if you are wisely selfish.
If you're wisely selfish. Okay, fair enough. All
Think
right.
of this. I mean, it
Mm.
just explains something which I think is very important. Because when you're starting any kind of inner process, you can only begin from the immediate space in which you are living. You can't start from where you are not. You have to start from where you are. And if you've been living a life clouded with egotism and attachment, that is precisely where the spiritual process must begin. You know, it really is a way of thinking about this matter. Because I know we've heard a lot of this talk about attachment being a great hindrance in the spiritual process. But, you know, I would question that. I don't see that all attachments have the same effects on the mind. For instance, there's a great difference between attachment to drugs, attachment to sex, attachment to gambling or wealth, as opposed to attachment to meditation, attachment to wisdom, attachment to self-knowledge. Because those are things which actually have the potential eventually to lead to being. And of course, let's assume you want to begin spiritual process. Of course, what will drive you to sit in meditation in the first place? Your ego has certain expectations as to what you're going to get from the process. Of course, you're attached to a certain benefit in the beginning. So I say that's extremely useful because at least your egotism will get the ball rolling, it will initiate the process. You're sitting in meditation, starting to become more sensitive and observant as to what's happening in your experience. That the limits of your identity start dissolving. And that is so.
Okay. So we have.
So yes, you're wisely selfish. So the turn your egotism and attachment into a bridge for inner transformation. You can turn that into a bridge because, as I had said, you can only begin from where you are, not from where you are not.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have 3 more questions from the audience, and then we'll let you go. I appreciate you sitting here and talking to me this whole time. I kind of feel bad, like you probably need a break.
I'd be happy to look into them.
All right, thank you, thank you. So the questions are as follows. The first one is, can scientific interventions alter karmic effects?
Alter karmic, the last word?
Effects, meaning that the technologies that we're developing, and I don't know how familiar you are with some of the technology. I don't know if this brother is thinking about some of the technology developments that I have in mind. I'm thinking at the degree of transhumanism and Microsoft HoloLens. And I don't know if you've seen the Microsoft HoloLens where you're projecting these holograms into the world and it's going to replace all cell phones, computers, television sets, etc. So does that affect our karma? Was the question.
Certainly, in the way that we become increasingly dependent on these technologies, definitely that affects our karma. And not just in terms of our psychological dependency, but I would question, I mean, it's good we're having the use of technology, but are we really using our technology wisely in a way that contributes to human well-being? That's also questionable. I mean, as a byproduct of a lot of the technology, we're creating a lot of damage to the environment on the planet. That leads to physical effects on your physical health, as well as your mental health. So certainly, all of these things do have an impact on your karma. However, I have to say that if we're talking about spiritual process, we're talking about rising in your independence and awareness beyond all of these compulsive influences. So either you will let these influences rule over you, you become a slave, or you can rise in awareness in such a way that regardless of the atmosphere in which you're surrounded by, nevertheless, you remain the master within yourself.
Okay. All right, next question. Mysterious Machine says, how to undo psychological damages of religious conditioning? I got another similar question. Let me go back to it before. Since it's similar, I'll just ask both of them. So how to undo psychological damages of religious conditioning. That's a good one. And my question is, what is the future? I kind of asked you a similar question. What does the future of religion look like? Do you see the religions of the world heading? What's your opinion about atheism? But it's a lot of different questions. I mean, I think you kind of touched on how you think that the science of yoga and the results that it yields is going to impact the future of religion. But perhaps this person means a similar question, like, do you think the dogmas are going to survive, or do you think that the yogic sciences are going to take over?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, I'm not so unrealistic enough to expect that we're going to experience any sort of mass enlightenment anytime soon. This is why I think it's very important that we nurture and we cultivate a culture of inquiry. That's quite difficult to do in a world where you're living with so many social pressures in a rat race, which at this rate seems to be destined to destruction. I mean, people are living a way of life where they're just struggling to make ends meet and pass through the day. So for a lot of people, who cares about enlightenment, who cares about wisdom, who cares about meditation and inquiry? They have some basic survival needs that they want to fulfill. So, but nevertheless, people are discontented with the current condition of things. That is something I don't underestimate, that there's this driving creative force within human life that is constantly seeking expansion. In fact, that is the whole process of evolution. Expect moving from one dimension to the next, to the next. So once it's just instinctive and automatic that once one level of well-being has been fulfilled, it's instinctive and automatic that one is going to seek the next level. But if that was a continuous process of growth, then I don't see how it would be possible that every human being wouldn't lead himself towards his enlightenment. But the problem is getting caught in the same vicious cycles, repeating the same vicious patterns. Yeah. And that's precisely the reason why history keeps repeating itself. I mean, we're too much fixed. I mean, it's good. We can have some temporary relief by taking care of the external world in a certain way. But ultimately, if we really understand that most of the human problems are self-created mind, then what are we going to do about that mind and the structure of that mind? So everything that we create in the society is just an extension of what are the inner qualities in which we are living. So if we're seeking enduring well-being, there needs to be a shift in another direction, where rather than only seeking external solutions, you're seeking a permanent solution. Mm-hmm. And the only real solution is a permanent solution. I mean, a temporary solution is not really a solution. You're just postponing the problem to tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. So really the question is if we can encourage a culture of inquiry which is more centered around examining the nature of human suffering. And I feel that there's not enough open discourse that has been happening on this. And certainly the world religions do not help, because part of a spiritual process means that you're involved in a process of questioning through the spirit of a beginner's mind. And you cannot know what you're seeking if you're a seeker of truth. That's intrinsic to the quality. If you know what you are seeking, then perhaps you're functioning bias. Mm-hmm. And that ties in exactly to what we were saying earlier. Even when it comes to certain paths of mysticism, I still don't see that, perhaps for a lot of them, that they cannot liberate the mind from dogmatism. Because you're entering into a mystical process of inquiry with a certain confirmation bias. And as long as that's there in the background, you will always interpret your experience according to the context of your chosen belief system. So whether it's organized religion or even the more liberal approaches of mystical process, it is very difficult to cultivate that spirit of inquiry, because you have to have enough doubt, the type of doubt that rips you apart in such a way that start questioning everything about the fundamentals of your life and even the nature of your being. And that could be, if you really approach it in that sense, it could be maybe a little bit uncomfortable in the beginning. it might take several years to rise to that level where I'll say you're not just a student, but you're a disciple.
Mm-hmm.
Disciple meaning not a disciple of a master or any particular person or tradition, but the spirit of a disciple, the attitude of a seeker of.
That seeking that you're talking about makes it.
And we'll find that, again, I know there's this way of thinking where it's become very popular to think that all the different paths and religions lead towards the same truth.
Right. They don't, right?
Obviously cannot be true. I mean, yeah, all these different interpretations and conclusions. The real question is, does a certain belief system, and this is what is much more important to me, examining the different religions and traditions, does a certain way of thinking or belief system strengthen or nourish the illusion of self? And that's why, we didn't really touch much upon it. That's one of the reasons why I have my criticism of traditions like Advaita. I feel that, is this something you want to get into? I don't know.
Today, I mean, we could. I mean, I want to get into the two questions that we have left. The topic of Advaita and Anatman or Shunyata is a topic that I've looked at quite a few times. I appreciate the knowledge that comes from it. I mean, if you want to touch on it, you can. I don't mind.
Well, what I was going to say is that concerning the idea that it's consciousness which is the fundamental reality of all things, my own attitude towards this is that this is something that can only be accepted on the basis of faith. And I can tell you my reasoning why. No amount, yes, you can enter very deeply into yourself and you can experience overwhelming, pure consciousness, but have within yourself that can verify whether this consciousness is eternal or not. It's not enough that it just gives you a profound, overwhelming sense. Because, for example, take the speed of light. Tremendous, unimaginable, and yet it's still finite. If consciousness is the foundation of everything, what that really means is that it's the laws of physics which stem out of consciousness, not consciousness which stems out of the laws of physics. So if this were really
emergent property argument, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So if this were really true, you should be able, through sheer subjective will, you should be able to grow a mango tree from an apple seed, or you should be able to set the planets out of their orbits, or modify the laws of physics. That's the other. And finally, I say that I really love one of the statements of Lao Tzu. He said, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Or what I like to say is, whatever you think it is what it is not. Because if we really consider this seriously, if truth is truly unthinkable and immeasurable, that means it's beyond thought. If it is beyond thought, all of your categories of knowledge, and therefore to think of it in terms of consciousness, there limits that would have to be abandoned.
Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, the very first chapter, has always been one of the most profound, inspirational literature that I've ever read. Particularly the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching is exactly what I understand in terms of oneness, non-duality, and that kind of thing. Now, with regards to consciousness, from what I understand you're saying is that if you can identify consciousness, and my thing is, consciousness is just another word for what Tattvam Asi means. I am that. You know what I mean? When you say whatever that is, if you decide to use another word instead of that and just say consciousness, it still doesn't define what it is. You know what I mean? It's to me, even calling it the Tao. Let's say you use the word Tao instead of consciousness. So whether you're using the word Tao, whether you're using the word consciousness, whether you're using the word ultimate reality, I think all of these words do injustice and can never do justice to what it is ultimately. And so I don't personally, I don't see
Yes.
the Advaita Vedanta perspective necessarily contradicting the Buddhist perspective. I think that it's really semantics. I really do.
I can't agree with that, because if you look at Buddhist thinking, they do not consider consciousness to be, and by the way, I don't consider myself a Buddhist. I'm not, I see Buddhism is loaded with its own dogmatism. I am not identified with any particular tradition, because truth must be the boundaries of all traditions. That's why I became extremely curious to see what are the common threads that are running throughout all of these traditions, because that shows you that there's a much deeper objective principle at work. That ties into what we were talking earlier about honoring certain traditions, because they do offer much value, not just in terms of the truths that they're trying to explain, but also in terms of human development. For example, I have reverence for alchemy, not because I agree with it, but because that was the first human effort to understand what eventually became chemistry. Same thing, astrology was the precursor to astronomy. So in that sense, I respect them because they were part of a human effort in deepening our understanding of the universe.
Awesome.
But coming back to what the whole issue of consciousness, is a contradiction. Because Buddhists is that consciousness is, rather than being some ultimate substance, rather one of what they call the five skandhas, permanent, and which give rise to the illusion of self. So there's certainly similarities between Advaita and Buddhism, but there's also quite significant differences. And the whole matter of whether there's an Atman or Anatman has been, as you know, a debate that has been continuing for centuries.
Right. I mean, for me, I never looked at it as an, well, I can't say I never looked at it as an emergent property. You know, so materialists will say that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. Some mystics will say that no, that physics is in fact an emergent property of consciousness. I've always understood and I've always perceived, to the best of my ability, that consciousness and physics are co-arising. That Purusha and Prakriti are co-arising and eternal. And that's how I've understood it. That's how I perceived it, and that's how I've understood it. Rather than one being an emergent property out of the other, they are co-emerging. And in physics, I would take the multiverse, and I would say that divinity or consciousness or whatever this fundamental reality is, that it then differentiates into everything that we know, or even everything that we don't know. So that's kind of a big problem, you know, the hard problem of consciousness. There's so much for us.
Well, I think there's a deeper problem here. I mean, the question of whether consciousness is an emergent property or something essential, I think that's really secondary to what I think is a much deeper problem, which is that even if you assume that consciousness is the fundamental ground of all things, this itself suggests a kind of dualism. Source, and you have everything that stems out of the source. And it's a bit like, for example, there can be no such thing as a creator without the idea of a created. They are dependent upon each other. That's why I don't think in terms of the ultimate reality, even as a source. I don't even think of it in terms of silence. I mean, we need to use words which can make it easier to digest. So sometimes I might talk in terms of the absolute or the infinite, but I want to be more accurate. I don't even think of it in terms of the absolute, because the absolute is just the polar opposite of the relative. If one disappears from your mental vision, the other also disappears from your vision. When I say that truth is unthinkable, I mean it in really the most serious sense. So coming to consciousness, if we think of consciousness as the ultimate ground of things, that gives the impression that there's some permanent center of authority around which everything else in the universe revolves. And that ultimately gives rise to a kind of dualism. So rather, my understanding is that there is no singular force upon which the whole universe depends. And that very emptiness, in a sense, very paradoxical, but that very emptiness or a lack of a permanent center is itself.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah.
So in other words, it's impossible.
Your latest video touches on this.
In other words, it's impossible for any one thing to arise as an independent reality or existence of its own. And that's part of my criticism of consciousness. However, I think we do need a balanced approach to this, because consciousness is a tremendously potent medicine and a mirror for realizing the divine. For example, the quietness lake. Think of your consciousness like the waters of a lake. And if the waters of your mind are quiet and silent, then it can reflect with its own corruptions and its own distortions, but it can reflect some quality. Through your consciousness, the light of that nature which is beyond consciousness can reflect itself through your consciousness. And in that sense, your consciousness can be filled with the light of the divine. You want to call it divine. So I'm not dismissing the relevance and importance of consciousness. And the Advaita way of thinking, because it's placed so much emphasis upon consciousness, I think that can be very fruitful, because that's to examine into the nature of their consciousness.
Awesome. No, I love it. I love it. I mean, you know, I do consider myself to be Advaitin. And for me, it wasn't a philosophical thing as much as it was an experiential thing. But when it comes to Maya in its understanding, I've had this conversation about, you know, what is Maya, what's not Maya, what's ultimate, what's real, what's absolute. I mean, these are philosophical meanderings that could go on literally. I mean, and the great sages and saints have debated this endlessly too. Even just trying to dive into the material is like, oh my gosh, like where's this? You know, how am I gonna solve this mystery? And for me, it was more of an experiential thing. I understand what the Buddhists are saying in terms of emptiness. I understand I profoundly understand what Advaita is getting at when it's talking about the non-duality of all things and the non-duality of the Atman and Brahman. And I respect that there's different opinions. You know, there's different opinions, and I appreciate that. So I've got one more question, because this is from Swati Shri, and she was the one who had originally asked me, can we ask Brother Amir Mourad questions? So I had to get her question in here, and I've been waiting to ask, and we'll make this the last question for today, and hopefully we can get you to come back in the future, because like I said, I think that there's a lot of people in the Middle East. There's a lot of people who have, you know, questioned Islam and stuff like that. They're looking for people to relate to, and looking for knowledge and information. And I think, Brother Amir, what you're doing can profoundly assist us with in that regard, particularly when it comes to the Dharmic traditions. And so the last question with Swati Shri says, Yogi Mourad, what is the one question humans can ask themselves in the present scenario that could make them look inwards towards consciousness?
Who am I?
Who am I? That's it.
And what is the nature of this thing that you call I? Does this thing experience, this impression of an I, does it have any true independent existence of its own, or does it arise as a consequence of many different elements? This is really the ultimate question. And I'm not going to answer it for you, but the value of the question is important. It reminds me of what I consider two of the most important statements that perhaps have been said in humanity, written on in the temple of Delphi in ancient Greece. Know thyself. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, you might be living as a king, we might be living as a beggar. But if you don't have yourself, you don't know yourself, ultimately within yourself, you're living like a beggar. So that is the most essential question in human life. Now, we are too much fixated upon the objects of our experience. But what is the nature of that intelligence seeing through the eye, ears, smelling through the nose, tasting through the tongue? That is the most essential question, because all of the conflict of human life is related. Out of ignorance about true nature, this gives rise to the feeling of the incompleteness of being. From the incompleteness of being, we have a desire to compensate. So we project our desires into the external world, facing so many different objects of desire, and ultimately finding that this not lead to enduring happiness and well-being. So the other question is, fact of life, that everything in the universe is constantly changing, your mind and body is always passing through a state of change, is always changing. Given that fact, how is enduring happiness and well-being possible?
Beautiful. Absolutely. I mean, Brother Amir, you know, the way that you've that you've answered all of the questions, it's always rare to hear someone answer questions and talk about information, and like almost everything resonates. And I think that you speak wonders in terms of how yoga and dharma and all of this is really impacting contemporary minds in profound ways. And you and the way that you answer questions, the way that you've answered questions today, is definitely a wonderful representation of that science and philosophy and mysticism can come together, and we can make better sense of the world, ask the better questions of such as who am I, and what are some methods and procedures that we can explore these questions. And that's
And if we ask the right questions, we're going to be asking questions which are relevant to pretty much anybody, regardless of differences of philosophies and beliefs, because as I had said, fundamentally, we're all seeking the same thing. Perhaps there's different methods or different approaches towards that. But if we ask the right question, we're going to be asking questions which is pretty much relevant to all human beings, which is, for example, what is the nature of suffering? Why do human beings suffer in the first place? Every single human being wants to rise beyond suffering. Even a masochist or a serial killer who might be running around killing people, his real drive is, of course, more misery for himself. He thinks that by killing other people and falling into this kind of addiction, that this is going to be once again the source of his happiness and well-being. So he's also concerned with well-being.
Absolutely. And in a metta bhavana meditation, that is something that we definitely focus on, is turning our attention to those that we find annoying, those that are the complete opposite of us, those that are vile and vicious and obnoxious, and rude, all of those judgments that we would have towards a particular type of person that is the opposite to who we are, and learning how to embrace them, right? Isn't that like one of the foremost practices of metta bhavana?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
And that's another thing that's absolutely relevant to our social environment, is how can we integrate compassion in a way where it can have more relevance in the world? And for that, of course, we have to ultimately open a new dimension of experience where you're no longer perceiving the other as separate from your being. And I think we don't even have to drag yoga or mysticism. We have enough scientific logic is on our side, the evidence is on our side, the reason is on our side. It's just a question of
I agree, completely agree. So it's beautiful to see. It's beautiful to meet like-minded people. I hope, definitely when I'm in Canada next, I would love to visit you. I would love to donate to your center, and I appreciate, all of the time that you've given to us, and hopefully we can see you again in the future, because I'm sure there's going to be times need your guidance, and And again, appreciate you and all of the work that you're doing there in Canada, brother Amir.
Thank you,
Namaskar.
Farhan. Namaskar.